The speaker is no longer there.
She is there.
I'm here.
Okay, very good.
I just don't have my video. I'll turn my video on when we start.
Ah, I see. Okay. Okay, I think we should start now.
I think, yeah, let's start. Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to this seminar series. My name is Savelo Jaindo Vukacheni, and we're pleased to welcome you to our second seminar under the series, The African Idea of Africa and the Future of African Studies, which is a collaborative initiative of us here at the University of Bayreuth, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, and Codesria. And today we're meeting during a special day, the Africa Day. And it is our great pleasure really to host you, Professor Robtel Nejai Pile. And my duty is really to introduce you, and then we will proceed. And procedurally, I will do the introductions, and then my colleague Robert will moderate the Q&A. Procedurally, again, we normally give our speakers 1 hour to present, and you already said you won't exhaust an hour. That will be fine. And in terms of introduction, Professor Robtel Pile is assistant professor in the International Social and Public Policy at the London School of Economics. And she comes from Liberia, is a scholar activist working at the intersection of critical African studies, critical development studies, and critical race studies. And the talk today is actually focused on her award-winning book, which is entitled Development, Dual Citizenship, and Its Discontents in Africa, the Political Economy of Belonging in Liberia. And I think it's a very relevant topic for today, the 25th of May, because it touches on issues of belonging, on issues of citizenship, and on issues of development. And Rob Telly completed a BA degree in African Studies and Literature at Howard University, and the MSc in African Studies at the University of Oxford, and a PhD in Development Studies at SOAS at the University of London. And they were really very happy, Robtel, that you honored our invitation. And we look forward to hearing from you. And I give the floor to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Sabelo for that very, very generous introduction. Now, Sabelo, I have to admit, is someone whose work I admire from near and afar. So the fact that he asked me to do this seminar, there is no way I could have said no.
Thank you.
Because in many respects, he's one of many people whose shoulders I stand on in terms of scholarship, in terms of critical analysis of the continent. So Sabelo, I just want to thank you for everything that you do for the continent.
Thank you.
It's tremendous, and you've sort of paved the way for those of us who will follow in your footsteps. So yes, thank you, Sabelo, for the introduction, but then also the invitation. I also want to thank the University of Beirut for hosting this in collaboration with GIAS as well as Codesria. For me, today is a very bittersweet day. So Sabelo mentioned, and I know many of you on this Zoom call will know that today is Africa Day, so the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, which would then become later, subsequently, the African Union. So we're celebrating the continent of Africa in all its various facets. But I think it's also important to remember that today is also a day of mourning. And the reason I say that is because 3 years ago, George Floyd, who became an international symbol of anti-Black violence, anti-Black police brutality, died 3 years ago, was murdered, was assassinated, asphyxiated on the streets of Minnesota 3 years ago today. So in that regard, I want us to just take a moment of silence, not just for the dearly departed George Floyd, but also everyone, all those who are of African descent who have been murdered, assassinated, asphyxiated in the name of injustice. So I hope that you would just indulge me for about 30 seconds for us to just reflect on what this day means in terms of its bittersweetness. Thank you very much for your indulgence. Okay, so without much ado, Sabelo's already sort of introduced the presentation, but what I will do is, I'm a little bit rusty because we haven't done a lot of Zoom presentations in a while. So please forgive me if I'm a bit of a technophobe. Please forgive me if there are any technical glitches. But what I will do now is I'm going to share my screen so you can actually see the presentation. And then I'm going to try to make it a slideshow. Let's see if that, I hope you all can see that.
Yes.
Okay. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. So the presentation features this monograph that I wrote that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Really honored that it won the African Politics Conference Group Book Award in 2022. And in terms of the presentation, what I want to do first and foremost is to talk about my major arguments. Now, Sabelo mentioned that I probably won't speak for the full 1 hour, but sometimes I just get ahead of myself. So I might exhaust the 1 hour. I'll try not to go over the 1 hour, of course. So part 1, I want to talk about my major arguments. So what do I set out to do in the book? In part 2, I want to talk about what I believe are my major contributions. And these are theoretical contributions, methodological contributions, as well as empirical contributions. So essentially, what does this book about Liberia have to say about the continent writ large, effectively? And then beyond the continent. And then in part 3, I want to talk about what the implications are for policymaking and practice, not only in the case study country, Liberia, but also across the continent. Yeah, okay. So in terms of the book, what's fascinating about the book and interesting about the book is that it focuses on Liberia. And what's interesting about Liberia is that Liberia, in terms of a case study, is Africa's first Black republic, right? So if you know nothing about Liberia, just remember that. And as a result of being Africa's first Black republic, Liberia was also the first country in the continent of Africa when it was established in 1847 to devise legal norms around membership, around citizenship, around belonging. And what I do in this book is that it really is the first study that investigates not only domestic, but also diasporic constructions and practices of citizenship across space and time, and their myriad implications for development. Now, in this book, I'm very critical about what I mean by development. In many respects, I think of myself as a critical development studies scholar. And critical development studies scholars will argue that development, in quotation marks, it's more than, in fact, it isn't the sort of single-minded pursuit of free market capitalism, right? Development goes beyond just pursuing economic growth. And development is certainly not sort of mimicking or even privileging Western whiteness and modernity. In this book, I'm very clear about the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, development is really about how people's experiences of poverty, how their experiences of privilege, how their experiences of progress, how their experiences of all the sort of myriad implications when we think about socioeconomic transformation and how these are affected by some sort of change, right? So development equals change. Development equals three major arguments that I set forward in the book. The first is that while mid-19th century Liberian citizenship was mid-19th century Liberian citizenship to mid-20th century Liberian citizenship was largely passive and constructed from above by a hegemonic state, mid-20th century Liberian citizenship onwards has largely been active and reconstructed from below by citizens themselves, largely through processes of protest, right? Political upheaval, conflict, so forth and so on, contestation. Now, why is this? There are three chapters in the book that are thematic in their orientation. So I focus on how, for instance, conflict configured and reconfigured Liberian citizenship across space and time. I also look at how migration and post-war recovery have configured and reconfigured Liberian citizenship across space and time. So these are historical as well as contemporary processes that have had some sort of impact on Liberian citizenship across space and time. Now let's give the example of migration, because each of these thematic issues are the subject of a particular chapter in the book. So there's a book on migration in which I talk about what's interesting about Liberia is that when the country was founded in 1847 in the mid-19th century, it was considered a country of relative immigration, IMMI, right? The vast majority of people who moved to Liberia they were Black migrants who came from the United States. They came from the Caribbean. They came from the Congo River Basin. So a lot of Liberians actually trace their ancestry to these first migrants who came, right? And when they came, they were considered immigrants, right? Immigrants. So in the mid-19th century, Liberia was considered a country of relative immigration, IMMI. However, legal norms around citizenship, around membership, around belonging were biased against what I call the rooted indigent. And what do I mean by this? There were, as is the case of human history, whenever a country is founded or established, in most cases, there are already people who are occupying that particular geographic territory. And that was certainly the case in Liberia when it was established in 1847 as Africa's first Black republic. Now, citizenship norms, regulations were biased against these rooted indigenous populations who occupied the coast where the first settlers arrived, but also further inland into the hinterland. And they were barred from obtaining citizenship, interestingly enough, the rooted indigent, for the first 100 years of Liberia's existence as Africa's first Black republic. So for the first century of Liberia's existence, these rooted indigents were barred from Liberian citizenship, right? So you see the irony, a country of relative immigration, but a country that bars those rooted indigents from obtaining citizenship for the first 100 years. Now, the interesting thing about Liberia now is it's considered a country of relative emigration now, EMI. However, before a dual citizenship bill was passed, and this is the subject of the book, the case study, Liberia was considered a country of relative emigration. However, citizenship norms, citizenship regulations were biased against what I call the rootless emigrant, right? So those Liberians who were born in the country or perhaps had Liberian ancestry and were born abroad were barred from having citizenship by ancestry or citizenship by birth, especially those who naturalized abroad when they left, either before, during, or after protracted armed conflict from 1989 to 2003. One of the things that I forgot to mention is I talk about the myriad experiences or conceptualizations of Liberian citizenship across space and time by using a proposed dual citizenship bill that was introduced in 2008 to ask wider questions about what does it mean to be a citizen? And not just what does it mean to be a citizen, but what does it mean to be a citizen in a post-war context like Liberia? So let's remember that bill that was introduced in 2008, but was not passed for about 10 years. It lingered in legislative limbo. And this bill is the subject, sort of the entry point for asking these wider questions about citizenship, membership, and belonging. So let's go back to the issue of migration. So you've got Liberia, country of relative immigration, Liberia, country of relative emigration in the first half of its existence. Now, these issues around migration, around belonging, around mobility are not really unique to Liberia because there are a number of scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani, who you would be familiar with in terms of his seminal text, Citizen and Subject, and other scholars like Bronwyn Manby, who's a colleague of mine here at the LSE, have argued that citizenship is viscerally contested in the African countries that have had the highest, the greatest levels of colonial era migration. Now, you might ask, well, if you're familiar with Liberia, you'll say, but Liberia was never colonized by European powers. It certainly wasn't colonized by European powers, but it did experience heightened levels of colonial era migration. And I spoke earlier about those Black migrants who came from the United States, from the Congo River Basin, from the Caribbean, who were fleeing, in many respects, economic servitude, who were fleeing racial injustice, and effectively wanted to establish a haven where Black people could be the ones who own the means of production, who were free, right? So it wasn't a country that was colonized formally by European powers, but it did experience heightened levels of colonial era migration. So this explains, as far as I'm concerned, it's the historical antecedent for why you have such contestations around dual citizenship in Liberia. The second argument that I make is that this sort of 21st century impasse or gridlock on dual citizenship is emblematic of these enduring struggles over citizenship. Now, as of June 2022, Liberia was one of 7 countries in the continent of Africa that actually prohibited dual citizenship. The other 6 were Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. Now, what's interesting is that Liberia actually eventually did pass a dual citizenship bill in July 2022. And we can talk a bit about that during the Q&A about what transpired to push the needle in that direction, right? But as of June 2022, it was one of 7 countries that prohibited dual citizenship. And in many respects, you can say that Liberia was an outlier because at that point, 30 years had passed where there's a sort of transnational tide and countries across the continent of Africa are liberalizing their citizenship laws. They're enabling dual citizenship, they're enabling multiple citizenships for a number of different reasons, right? As of June 2022, Liberia is still an outlier until it passes its dual citizenship law in July 2022. The third argument that I make is that domestic as well as diasporic actors interpret, understand, experience citizenship, interpret dual citizenship and its ramifications quite differently based on what the development sociologist Norman Long calls their social locations, which is a really fancy way of saying their socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as their life worlds or their lived experiences, right? So when I spoke to a number of Liberians in the country, because I did interview about 200 plus Liberians in 5 cities, 5 countries, 3 continents, which I'll talk to you a bit about later in my methodological section. When I spoke to a lot of Liberians in the country, they effectively view dual citizenship as a zero-sum game, as potentially infringing upon their already very limited access to political, economic, and social rights, as privileging what they viewed as a seemingly already privileged group of transnational actors, i.e. diasporic Liberians who lived abroad and naturalized and have all these other passports, right? And now want to come back and reclaim Liberian citizenship. So they view dual citizenship as a zero-sum game, as potentially even reproducing socioeconomic inequalities that have been embedded in Liberia since its very formulation in 1847. However, when I spoke to a lot of diasporic Liberians, they view dual citizenship as a development enabler, right? As producing socioeconomic transformation based on their intense political, economic, and social contributions, their remittances, their investments in productive sectors such as agriculture, real estate, so forth and so on. And they figured that if you enact dual citizenship in Liberia, it would only entrench those contributions of those Liberians who live abroad, those transnational actors. So you already see this dichotomy between what I view as domestic anxieties around dual citizenship and diasporic aspirations about what dual citizenship will actually portend. Now let's talk a little bit about these diasporic aspirations versus the domestic anxieties. Now on the screen, you will see two quotes that I have pulled from my semi-structured interviews conducted in 2013 with Liberian policymakers. And the reason I've pulled these two quotes from the book is that they really are emblematic of that dichotomy, that contrast between the diasporic and the domestic, diasporic aspirations versus domestic anxieties. So the first quote is from Cletus Watterson. He was the chief sponsor of the 2008 dual citizenship bill that I mentioned that lingered in legislative limbo for about 10 years and was never passed. He was the chief sponsor of that bill. He was also a senator at the time, like a senior senator at the time, so very influential, very prominent. And for me, the quote that I've pulled from him is emblematic of this idea of diasporic aspiration. So he says, and I quote a lot of them, and he's talking about Liberians who live abroad, had to change their lifestyle, accept the dictates from a strange country for survival. In some countries, it meant you had to become a citizen of that country to enjoy the benefits. But in taking that involuntary stance, it qualified them for disqualification of their citizenship in their own country, Liberia, which I believe is unfair. So that's Cletus Watterson, really kind of encapsulating what these diasporic aspirations are. Now let's go to the second quote. This is from Jewel Howard Taylor. Now, if you're familiar with Liberia or unfamiliar with Liberia, you'll know that Jewel Howard Taylor is now vice president of Liberia. So a very powerful woman in the country. At the time when I interviewed her in 2013, she was a senior senator and also a co-sponsor of this dual citizenship bill, but she was able to somehow intuit the domestic anxieties around dual citizenship. And she argues, and I quote, you know, Liberians here, she means Liberia, a lot of them are not working. They're unemployed and they feel as if Liberians coming from the diaspora who have had all of these opportunities, whether that's reality or perception, who have had all these opportunities, want to come and take their space. So you already kind of can understand the domestic anxieties. And I would even take her quote further and say that it wasn't just Liberians who were socioeconomically deprived. It was Liberians who were doing relatively well, right? Middle-class Liberians who felt this intense anxiety around the potential implications for dual citizenship for them individually, but also for the country writ large, right? Domestic anxieties versus diasporic aspirations. The other thing that I do throughout the book is I try to provide a critical framing of citizenship, but beyond a critical framing of citizenship, also a critical framing of development. I already told you that I kind of model myself after critical development studies scholars, and I think of myself as a critical development studies scholar. So in terms of the critical framing of citizenship, I think of citizenship, as do a number of sociologists, as a continuum, right? As a continuum of both inclusion as well as exclusion, but because by virtue of determining who a citizen is, you're also definitively stating who and demarcating who a citizen is not, right? So that continuum of inclusion versus exclusion. I've also borrowed from a number of feminist scholars who argue that citizenship is not gender neutral, right? Citizenship is multi-layered. It's differentiated by gender, by race, by class, by ability, by ethnicity, by region, by religion, so forth and so on, right? So citizenship as multi-layered and differentiated. What's interesting about Liberia is it's incredibly emblematic of that multi-layeredness. So I'll give you an example. Liberia is one of two countries in the continent of Africa. Sierra Leone is the other. Now, this is the subject of my new book. So if you want to have a conversation about that, we can certainly talk about it during the Q&A. So Liberia is one of two countries in the continent of Africa that prohibits people of non-Negro descent from obtaining citizenship. Now, Sierra Leone citizenship laws are a bit more liberal than Liberia because they allow people of non-Negro African descent to naturalize. Liberia doesn't even allow naturalization. It says that if you are not of Negro descent, you will never obtain citizenship, whether by birth, whether by naturalization, whether by ancestry, so forth and so on. So you can see that sort of differentiated nature of citizenship based on race within the context of Liberia. Now, there's a whole history for why Liberia and Sierra Leone have what I call Negro clauses. And the title of the book, the new book that I'm working on, is called Africa's Negro Republic. So it's a case study, a sort of comparative case study of Liberia and Sierra Leone. So when those migrant settlers came from the Caribbean, the Congo River Basin, as well as the United States, I said that they were fleeing economic servitude, right? So they basically wanted to establish a haven in the continent of Africa where they would be able to control the means of production. So they inserted, Liberians at the time, inserted in the citizenship laws, inserted in the Constitution, this Negro clause that says only people of Black, Negro, African descent would be able to obtain citizenship. So in terms of the critical framing of development, I think of development in many respects as a process of both amelioration, betterment, moving forward, progress, but also a process of degeneration. And for me, this is emblematic of that idea of the domestic anxieties, right? So a lot of people will argue that dual citizenship will lead to development, progress, movement, forwardness. And a number of Liberians that I spoke to on the ground particularly thought of dual citizenship as a process of degeneration, not a process of amelioration at all. So that idea of juxtaposing development as both amelioration and degeneration is something that I do throughout the book through my interlocutors, right? Another thing that I do throughout the book is that I try to interrogate the sort of presumed symbiotic relationship between development and dual citizenship. Again, enacting dual citizenship, the assumption is that it will lead to development. Now, there are a number of critiques in the literature by scholars across the globe who think of dual citizenship as incredibly problematic, right? So in this book, I interrogate this presumed symbiotic relationship by framing dual citizenship as viscerally contested in Liberia, but also as viscerally contested in a number of countries that have taken 10, 15, 20 years to establish and legislate dual citizenship, right? So it's viscerally contested as a development intervention. So in terms of the critiques of dual citizenship, some scholars have argued that dual citizenship is essentially just about extending rights without necessarily extracting responsibilities. There's even a scholar by the name of Peter J. Spiro, who's a legal scholar, who says that dual citizenship is about a la carte citizenship. So you pick and choose what's important in terms of the privileges as well as the rights, but you don't necessarily try to fulfill any responsibilities or obligations, right? So dual citizenship as extending rights to would-be transnational actors without necessarily extracting any responsibilities from them, citizenship a la carte. There's another scholar who says that there really isn't any sort of empirical correlation that has been able to determine a relationship, right, between dual citizenship enactment and even the increased economic contributions of transnational actors or diasporas, right? So there's no real evidence that proves if you enact dual citizenship, then those who live abroad who have two passports or multiple passports will increase their socioeconomic contributions to the nation state. The third thing that I try to do is that I'm very, very intentional about centering the domestic citizenship practices of those who live in Liberia. For me, that's key to socioeconomic transformation, key to socioeconomic exchange. And the reason I do that is because I'm attempting to challenge the literature that tends to privilege the citizenship claims of immigrants solely, right? This diasporas and development literature is fraught with all kinds of claims about how immigrants are the panacea to post-war reconstruction, are the panacea to development in their homeland countries. And I say, wait a second, as far as I'm concerned, it's the domestic citizens who are the sine qua non to development in our countries, our respective countries across the continent. And we can't discount their contributions by privileging these transnational actors, which I believe that the diasporas and development literature does kind of ad nauseum. Another thing that I try to do is I'm in a conversation with not only decolonial scholars such as Sabelo, but also post-colonial scholars who come before us who are very, very critical of the sort of neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors, again, as the panacea to development, as the panacea to post-war reconstruction. And so what I try to do throughout the book is I present the sort of nuanced dichotomy, right? So as far as I'm concerned, diaspora's citizenship claims, as well as their development claims, are just as contested as donors' development claims, right? I also present diasporas as both enablers of development, but also spoilers of development, especially in a post-war context like Liberia. In addition, I tried to present diasporas as a silver lining, not a silver bullet. Again, they're not the panacea to post-war reconstruction in context of conflict-affected countries. So there's an example that I want to give. There's a chapter, it's the last empirical chapter, and it's called The Dichotomy of Diasporic Developmentalism. If you read the book or you intend to read the book, you'll notice that I am a huge fan of alliteration. So that DDD, right? The Dichotomy of Diasporic Developmentalism is a chapter that I have where I try to unpack these ideas of the neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to post-war reconstruction. And what I try to demonstrate throughout this book is that diasporas are able to help, but also contrastingly, they also hinder post-war development, post-war reconstruction. And I do this through examples of how Liberians who came back during the sort of second post-war moment between 2005 and then 2005 onwards have been involved in what I call public sector productivity. So a number of Liberians who were hired by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf between 2005 and 2018 were very, very, very important, instrumental in driving development dividends in the country. So I'll give you an example. There was a finance minister by the name of Antoinette Saye. She's US trained. I believe she worked at the World Bank for a number of years before Ellen Johnson Sirleaf recruited her from Washington, DC. And she was able, through her efforts, to ensure that after about 2 years of negotiating with commercial creditors, but also international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, Liberia was able to get $4.9 billion canceled in debt. Right. And that has huge implications for what the country is able to do, because if you're not servicing debt, you can use revenue generated from a number of different productive sectors to focus on education, to focus on health, to focus on those sectors that are incredibly important, to focus on infrastructure, incredibly important for building a country that has been affected by armed conflict. Right. So post-war public sector productivity is what a number of Liberians who were recruited by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf were able to engage in, right? Changing the politics of what does it mean to be a technocrat, but also someone who has the capacity to drive development dividends in the country. However, there are a number of examples of Liberians who were involved in the opposite of that, what I call corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. There's that alliteration again. So public sector productivity versus post-war profiteering, corrupt forms of post-war profiteering. There were a number of examples of Liberians who were implicated in some of the most high-profile graft cases. Effectively, what did they do? They came back to Liberia and they got their fingers, their hands caught in the cookie jar. A number of them were implicated in cases in which millions of dollars were stolen, I should say allegedly stolen, from the national coffers. And do you know what a lot of these Liberians, these transnational Liberians did after they were implicated in these cases? They packed up their bags, they resigned, and they left. And to this day, very few of them have actually been prosecuted, right? So you have a contrast again between public sector productivity and post-war profiteering by those who were recruited or those who had sort of transnational lives before they joined government in 2005, 2006 and onwards. And so there's a phrase that I coined in the book. So if you want to use this phrase, I ask that you please cite the book. It's Sirleaf's diaspocracy. And what do I mean by a diaspocracy? Effectively, a diaspocracy is a regime in which you have an outsized influence of diasporas or returnees who are involved in managing the affairs of the homeland government, right? So I talked about all these recruits who would come from parts of the United States, but also parts of Europe, and then also parts of the West African sub-region, who were incredibly involved in managing the affairs of the state in very high profile positions. So someone like an Antoinette Saye, who became Minister of Finance. There were a number of Liberians who were also contracted, appointed to head what they call SOEs, our cash cows, so the state-owned enterprises and the parastatals, which were important in terms of revenue generation, right? So that outsized influence of diasporas or returnees in managing the affairs of the homeland government. Now, Sirleaf was not the only diasporocrat in the continent of Africa. There are a number of other examples. I would say Paul Kagame in Rwanda could be characterized as a diasporocrat, even though he hired or appointed a lot of Rwandans who come from the sub-region in Central Africa. There's also Farmajo, who was in Somalia, a diasporocrat who appointed and hired a number of Somalis who come from abroad. There's also Ernest Bai Koroma in Sierra Leone, who's very, very much part and parcel of that diaspocracy in Sierra Leone, who recruited and hired and appointed a number of Sierra Leoneans who lived abroad and spent considerable amounts of time outside of the country. And then outside of the continent of Africa, you also have a number of examples of diasporocrats or diaspocracy. So Ashraf Ghani, for instance, in Afghanistan, who'd been recruited from the United States, came back to serve his country, had hired, appointed, recruited a number of Afghans who'd lived abroad for a number of years. So that outsized influence of those who come from abroad, who are responsible for managing the affairs of the homeland government. And in many respects, there's a disconnect between those diasporocrats or those diasporocrats who are hired and those who remain in the country, perhaps have never left the country, right? So that tension definitely is pervasive when you have a diaspocracy. And the reason the diaspocracy is so problematic, as far as I'm concerned, is that you have a sort of reproduction of the international system of unequal pay. Because when you hire, when you appoint, when you recruit people from abroad, you have to pay them, or you do, diasporocrats will pay them considerably more than those who might be considered local hires, right? And for me, this is really that reproduction of the international system of unequal pay, in which you have a parallel diasporic hegemony versus that sort of replaces an expat hegemony. And what do I mean by this? A number of international organizations, Liberia parroted, right? So the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, when they hire so-called expat workers from abroad, sometimes they pay them considerably more than those who live in local staff who live in the country. And Liberia reproduced this system of unequal pay by giving top-up salaries to those who'd been recruited from abroad, in which case there were some Liberians, specifically those who were heading state-owned enterprises, who were paid 10, 20 times more than so-called local staff, right? So that reproduction of inequality, that reproduction of the international system of unequal pay is very, very, very much part and parcel of diaspocracies across the globe, and certainly diaspocracies in the continent of Africa. So what a lot of Liberians argued in the country, some of them, but also outside of the country, is that if you enact dual citizenship, what you will eventually do is enacting dual citizenship, as far as they were concerned, entrenches the system of unequal pay, right? Entrenches the system of inequality as it relates to remuneration, right? So diaspocracy, a term that I coined throughout the book in terms of a new way of theorizing how we think about diasporas and their relationship to development. So in terms of my theoretical contributions, I want to switch gears and talk about that, kind of taking off from this idea of a diaspocracy, to say that in the book, what I try to do is that I employ, but then I also expand Norman Long's notion of actor-oriented analysis. So I mentioned earlier that Norman Long, I take a lot of inspiration from, because he was a development sociologist who was very concerned about how marginalized actors in a development ecosystem respond to policy prescriptions or even development interventions. And so what actor-oriented analysis attempts to do is to demonstrate that in a development ecosystem, you have a number of different actors, and all of those actors have the knowledgeability, they have the capacity, they have the agency to act. Now, obviously, because of structural or socioeconomic impediments, there's some actors within a development ecosystem who are more powerful than others, right? There's some actors in a development ecosystem whose agency is more limitless than others. But he says all of those actors have the capacity, all of those actors have the agency to act. And what's very, very interesting about actor-oriented analysis is that Norman Long says that we can't assume that those actors who might be poorer, who might be less powerful, do not have the capacity to subvert. In fact, he says that those poorer and less powerful, more marginalized in a particular development ecosystem, have the capacity to subvert sometimes the best laid plans of those who might be more prosperous or powerful, right? And he says that what we need to look at is something called the interface. He says in a development ecosystem, there's always some sort of negotiation taking place. And this negotiation takes place at the interface, right? The interface is a site of negotiation, which the development actors it might be impossible for them to reconcile each other's differences, right? So they're not able to come up with any sort of compromise. And there's a divergence, right? Or confrontation or conflict constantly. But he says in a development ecosystem, the actors can also compromise. They can accommodate each other's differences. There can be processes of agreement in which convergence takes place. And for me, this is really important because when I'm thinking about contestations around dual citizenship, when I'm thinking about contestations around development, I'm very interested in how seemingly marginalized actors, i.e. domestic Liberians who might be socioeconomically deprived, had the knowledgeability and the capacity to subvert the best laid plans of these policymakers that I talked about earlier, right? So remember I said that the dual citizenship bill was suspended, postponed, lingered in legislative limbo for about 10 years. And for me, it was because of these domestic anxieties, these domestic kind of pushback against dual citizenship. That's one of the main reasons why the bill wasn't passed for such a long period of time, right? So the idea of looking at the most marginalized, the least powerful, the least prosperous in a particular development ecosystem and seeing how they have the capacity to act, the knowledgeability to respond to what might be policy prescriptions or development interventions that don't necessarily serve their intention or their purposes is really, really important. But what I do with this idea of interfaces, I'm very interested in moving it beyond an encounter over a particular development intervention, right? So, or physical encounter over a development intervention. And I move beyond Norman Long's notion of the localized, right? The bounded encounters over development projects to really think about the interface as a transnational ideological exchange that has no sort of physical encounter, right? A transnational exchange, a battle over what we might call the pros, the merits, or the cons, the demerits of dual citizenship as a proposed policy prescription that has some sort of development implications. So what I do throughout the book is I come up with a sort of theoretical framework, right? And I think of citizenship as a triad. The reason I think about citizenship as a triad within the context of Liberia and also outside of the context of Liberia, even in countries that have not experienced political upheaval or any sort of conflict or crisis, is that identities, practices, and relations between people, a number of scholars have argued, transform in the aftermath of violent conflict, right? So there's a triad that I've come up with that I think can apply to these sites of political upheaval or post-war context, but also beyond the post-war context. So this triad has 3 nodes. One of the nodes of the triad is citizenship as identity, citizenship as passive, right? And what do I mean by passive? Identity-based citizenship is citizenship that's really nothing is required of you, right? It's about claiming rights. And in many respects, it's about the fact that you were born in a particular locale, or maybe you have ancestry from a particular locale. There's nothing active that's a part of this identity passive-based form of citizenship. Usually it's citizenship that's conferred upon you because of these characteristics that you have that you have no control over. But I think what's interesting based on conversations that I had with my interlocutors is that in a post-war kind of moment, Liberians have moved to a more practice, active-based form of citizenship. And that's the second node of the Liberian citizenship triad, right? So citizenship as contribution is something that kept coming up over and over again in my interviews, right? So it's what you do with that identity is what makes you a citizen. Are you paying your taxes? Are you building Liberian capacities? Are you abiding by the laws of the nation state? That's what makes you a citizen, not the kind of passport you wield. In fact, one of my former colleagues and interlocutors said, they're all blue these days. Passports are all blue these days. So it's not about the passport, it's about what you do with that identity that makes you a citizen. It's how you contribute to other Liberians, to the nation state is what makes you a citizen. And the last note of the triad is citizenship as a set of relationships, right? So this is an interactive form of citizenship. It's how do citizens interact with one another, but how do they also interact with their governments? So you can think about this 3-node triad as identity is about claiming rights. You can think about practice as fulfilling responsibilities. And you can think about this idea of the set of relationships as maintaining or cultivating relationships. So there's a 3 R's, rights, responsibilities, and relationships. That's very, very much grafted onto this idea of the Liberian citizenship triad. So in addition of thinking about citizenship as a triangle, I also theorize citizenship as what I call a political economy of belonging. So that's the subtitle of the book. And what do I mean when I say political economy of belonging? So essentially, what I'm talking about is development, right? So it's another way of thinking about development as a sort of emancipatory structural transformation. And that's when socioeconomic transformation actually depends on what I call the provision of privileges and protections. So what we might think about as rights, in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and obligations, what we might think about as responsibilities. And then thirdly, I'm very interested and intentional about theorizing citizenship from the perspective of a post-war African country. So we're thinking through this seminar series as the new kind of idea of Africa, right? So in this book, what I try to do is to put forward a form of citizenship that thinks about citizenship within the context of this post-war African country of emigration. And in doing this, what I'm doing also is expanding the contours of the citizenship literature, right? And expanding the contours of the citizenship literature by moving from what I believe citizenship studies to be is incredibly Eurocentric, incredibly abstract, to think about citizenship as something that's incredibly concrete, but also very, very Afrocentric, right? So when I'm presenting the book or I'm presenting the triad, I say to people, this conceptualization of citizenship, this theorization of citizenship comes from the context of Liberia, but it can be applied to other contexts in the continent of Africa, but also the fact that it travels, right? That it can be grafted onto citizenship contexts in Europe and Latin America and Asia and so forth and so on, because it's broad enough to encapsulate all these different experiences of post-war versus non-post-war. Okay, so let's move to my methodological and empirical contributions. So the book is multi-sided. I mentioned earlier that it's based on about 200 plus in-depth, semi-structured interviews that I did with primarily Liberian actors in 5 cities, 5 countries, 3 continents. So the capitals of Liberia, Monrovia, Freetown, Sierra Leone, Accra, Ghana, London, UK, and Washington, DC, US. And the reason I did this is because I was really fascinated by the work of Saskia Saskins on the global city. And Saskia Saskins argues that cities or urban centers are the sites in which citizenship is most viscerally contested. So I wanted to test out her hypothesis and her theory by applying it to what we might call non-global cities. So Monrovia is certainly not a global city when we think about global cities. Freetown, Accra, Washington, DC, to a certain extent, could be considered a global city, and London is definitely considered a global city. So these urban centers in which citizenship is viscerally contested was a hypothesis that I wanted to try out. Now, I'm very aware and I am very clear and sort of explicit about the fact that I understand my book suffers from what we might call an urban bias. So my response to those who have that particular critique is nothing stops the next researcher from picking up from where I left off and interviewing people in rural sectors to find out if there's any sort of purchase in terms of this particular analytical frame. So the book is incredibly comparative in its expansive analysis. So I'm very interested in how what I call homelanders, Liberians who lived in the country before, during, and after the war, may have never left the country, or if they did leave, they left for very short periods of time. They considered Liberia to be their only home, hence the term homelanders. And I'm very interested in comparing, contrasting their conceptualizations of citizenship, their contestations around dual citizenship, with those who are the returnees, whether conditional returnees or permanent returnees. I'm also interested in comparing, contrasting executive level policymakers, again, policymakers that were appointed by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for instance, ministers, deputy ministers, and those who are legislative policymakers, primarily those who sponsored the dual citizenship bill. What I discovered is that executive level policymakers, even though there's a very clear sort of stance pro-dual citizenship stance by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, there are a number of executive level policymakers, some of whom were homelanders, who were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. Again, it's because of the same kind of domestic anxieties about the fact that dual citizenship could reproduce inequalities, the fact that dual citizenship could infringe upon people's rights in the country, the fact that dual citizenship is privileging an already seemingly privileged group of people. And then last but certainly not least, in terms of that dichotomizing or that contrast, I'm very interested in this book and intentional in this book in terms of nuancing the sort of contrast between what Nicholas Van Heer calls the near diasporas versus the wider diasporas. So in the context of my research, the near diasporas would be those Liberians who settled in Sierra Leone and Ghana. The wider diasporas would be those Liberians who settled in the UK as well as the US. Now, this is important to me because I think, again, the diasporas, the migration literature tends to privilege what we might deem the wider diasporas, when in actuality, the vast majority of Africans travel within the continent. So intra-African migration is 80% of African migration. Very few Africans end up on those rickety boats through the Mediterranean, even though that tends to be the international reportage. So it seems as if all these Africans are leaving the continent of Africa, when in actuality, there have been a number of studies by the UN Economic Commission for Africa, a number of studies by International Organization for Migration that have actually demonstrated through evidence that most Africans travel within the continent. And when they travel within the continent, they go to regional hubs. They go to these urban hubs, such as Lagos, such as Cape Town, such as Johannesburg, such as Nairobi, such as Tunis, right? Most Africans travel within the continent of Africa. So I was comparing, contrasting the near and wider diasporas because I wanted to, in some ways, challenge this idea that most Africans leave the continent. And it's certainly the case that most Liberians who left Liberia before, during, or after the war settled in the West African subregion. They didn't go to the United States. They didn't go to Europe. The last thing that you see on this slide is a breakdown of the 202 Liberian respondents that I interviewed in terms of their analytical category, but also the sites where I interviewed them. And I'm not going to belabor this. If you have any questions, we can certainly talk about it during the Q&A. What I want to move to is part 3, which is the last part of the presentation, to talk about what are the implications of my findings, what are the implications of my theorizing for policymaking in Liberia, also practice in Liberia. So there's a table that I've pulled from one of the chapters in which I demonstrate the dual citizenship perspectives amongst the 202 Liberian respondents that I interviewed. And there are 2 things that I want to highlight in this. The first is what is highlighted in green is the percentage or the actual raw number of Liberians who supported dual citizenship in principle, the ones that I interviewed, right? The ones who were part of my interview respondent pool. Now, I've been talking a lot about dichotomies. I've been talking a lot about contrasts. I've been talking a lot about discontinuities. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of those I interviewed, whether they be in the country or outside of the country, about 61% of them viewed dual citizenship in principle as a potential development enabler, right? About 61%, 123 out of 202. Contrastingly, if you look at those who reject dual citizenship, that which is highlighted in red, about 18% rejected dual citizenship outright, right? Saw it as a development disenabler. Now, what's interesting is if you look at this table, you'll see that the vast majority of those who rejected dual citizenship outright are those who were based in Monrovia, right? Many of whom consider themselves to be homelanders, or that's how I describe them, as homelanders. Now, I'm very clear throughout the book to say that this study is exploratory in nature. It's not representative. It was never intended to be representative. But what I did do was I triangulated my exploratory qualitative sources with more quantitative survey-based sources through the Afrobarometer survey. Now, I'm sure a lot of you on this call will know that Afrobarometer is a Pan-African survey that's been around for about 30 years that basically measures political trends throughout the continent of Africa. Interestingly enough, in the Afrobarometer survey that was conducted in Liberia in both 2012 as well as 2018, there were a number of questions about citizenship, one explicitly about dual citizenship that asked respondents, do you agree with dual citizenship? Do you believe that someone who wants to obtain 2 citizenships, Liberia and another, should be able to obtain 2 citizenships? 2/3 of those who were surveyed, now this is more representative, right? Because it's an Afrobarometer survey. 2/3 of those who were surveyed rejected dual citizenship outright. And that's interesting for me because if you look at this particular exploratory table from my own small respondent pool, again, the vast majority of people who rejected dual citizenship outright were those who were based in the country, specifically in Monrovia, right? But let's go back to those who support dual citizenship, about 61%. Now, what I argue throughout the book is that this idea of dual citizenship as perceived as a development enabler, again, going back to that 61% of those who supported dual citizenship in principle, was actually emblematic of a national referendum result, even though you had the Afrobarometer survey in 2012 and 2018 that says the vast majority of people in the country reject dual citizenship or see dual citizenship as a development disenabler. So Liberia has a national referendum in 2020, and unfortunately or unfortunately, depending on what side of the spectrum you fall on, there were 8 propositions, none of which were actually able to get the 2/3 majority or garner the 2/3 majority in order to have some sort of impact on constitutional change, right? So this referendum, one of the propositions, in fact, proposition 1 was on dual citizenship. And what's interesting is that what I demonstrate throughout the book, even though the book was finalized before this national referendum came, is that in many respects, Liberia is following continental trends, even though it still happens to be an outlier before July 2022. The fact of the matter is continental trends are evident, right? So even though this particular proposition on dual citizenship didn't garner the 2/3 majority, there seems to be something happening in Liberia's 15 subpolitical divisions in which people are warming up to the idea of dual citizenship, right? A sort of transnational tide that's changing people's perceptions of what dual citizenship can and cannot do. So there were 5 political subdivisions. Montserrado happens to be one of them. Montserrado is where Monrovia lies, the capital. 5 subpolitical divisions that were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. However, if you look at the Montserrado results, and I've kind of superimposed it on this particular slide, you see an almost even split, right? So we're looking at valid ballots. There were a number of invalid ballots in this particular referendum. I'm discounting those. But if you look at the valid ballots, in terms of this question about whether or not dual citizenship should be legislated, you see about 96,000 of those who had the valid ballot saying yes, right? On the other hand, in terms of the no votes, you have about 97,000 Liberians in Montserrado County, where the capital Monrovia lies, where I did most of my interviews, saying no. Now, it's a difference of about 1,000 votes. Very, very, very marginal difference, right? So there's almost this sort of even split between the yes votes and the no votes, which is in stark contrast to the 2012 Afrobarometer survey data results and the 2018 Afrobarometer survey data results, in which the vast majority of those surveyed in the country rejected dual citizenship. So the argument that I'm making in the book, even before this national referendum, is that in many respects, dual citizenship is an eventuality for Liberia, given its migration history, given its history of displacement, movement, mobility, so forth and so on. There's a sort of transnational tie that's eventually going to affect the country to the point where it does legislate dual citizenship. And that's precisely what happens in July 2022 when a dual citizenship bill is passed, right? So even though you have this sort of even split between the yes and the no votes in the Montserrado County, which is emblematic in many respects of the entire country, and even though you have this sort of warming up to dual citizenship amongst a large population of the country, what I argue throughout the book now, and even after the bill was passed, is that Liberia has to take a gradual, phased approach to dual citizenship, given that there's so many people who still view dual citizenship with a sort of anxiety filtered lens. Now, this particular slide you'll see is a bit of a shameless plug. So in 2021, there was a House bill, because the 2008 bill had been kind of discontinued, discarded. In 2021, the Liberian House of Representatives is able to pass a dual citizenship bill. It's a more progressive bill than the one that was introduced in 2008 in many respects. And what do? Because they're the lower chamber of the legislature, they have to pass on the bill that they passed to the Senate, which is the upper chamber of the legislature. Now, the Senate has some of the most anti-dual citizenship proponents throughout the legislature. So what happens is I get a call from the president pro temp of the Senate in November 2021, after the dual citizenship bill is passed by the House of Representatives. Now, I'm not really sure how he got my number, but he says, Robtel, hello. I've heard through the grapevine that you've written this book on dual citizenship and you have a number of policy recommendations that could help in our deliberation on the House bill that's been passed. There are a number of people in the Senate who are apprehensive about what dual citizenship, what the implications of dual citizenship are. Can you come to Liberia and present to us not only your findings, but also your policy recommendations to help us in our deliberations? Now, any scholar who does policy relevant work will tell you that if you get a call from the president pro temp of a country where you're doing research on, you say yes. So of course, I dropped everything I was doing and I went to Liberia and I did this presentation to the Senate. I presented my findings, but also presented concrete recommendations about what they could do with the bill that had already been passed by the House, what possible revisions could be made to the bill to make it a bit more robust. And one of the recommendations that I said to them is, you have to take a gradual phased approach, given that there's so much contestation in the country. The second recommendation that I made to the Senate is, it's important to reconcile the contradictions between the 1986 Constitution and the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Law, because they're in almost stark opposition to one another, right? So the 1986 Constitution is more permissive, seemingly more permissive of dual citizenship, whereas the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Law is prohibitive of dual citizenship. And what's interesting is that the final law that was passed in July 2022 does reconcile these stark contradictions between the law and the Constitution. The second recommendation that I make to the Senate is, it's important to reform the judiciary, focus on the rule of law, because what I kept hearing over and over again, especially amongst Liberians in the country, is people flout Liberian laws, right? Especially those transnational actors who carry two passports in a de facto way, even though we have not legislated dual citizenship. So how do we enforce, how does Liberia enforce the laws that already exist to ensure that people do not abuse the privilege of dual citizenship when it is eventually enacted? And I did say when, because I knew that the bill would possibly get through, right? With some revisions and tweaking here and there. The third and most important recommendation that I made to the Senate is, how do we address inequalities head on? Inequalities around income, the fact that we have this diaspocracy that's very, very pervasive. Inequalities around land access. So in Liberia, as is the case across a number of countries in the continent of Africa, citizenship and land ownership are inextricably tied. If you are not a citizen, you cannot own land, right? And what happened during the war is a lot of Liberians left and settled abroad, but they maintained land, they maintained large acreages of land, right? And during the war, a lot of squatters have now occupied that territory, and it's creating a sort of powder keg where you have people who are claiming rights to land who live abroad. So if you legislate dual citizenship, those people can now come back and claim that land as theirs because they have the right to do so. And those who have now become squatters. So as far as I'm concerned, it's going to create some sort of tension, rift. And in many respects, that might be a conflict generator. So how do we ensure that we focus on inequalities of land access? And then last, but certainly not least, in terms of transitional justice, Liberia had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A report came out that basically implicated a number of Liberians, transnational actors, who were involved in money laundering, who were involved in reaping the benefits of the spoils of war, who were involved in fueling the armed conflict by supporting rebel factions, right? They are implicated in our Truth and Reconciliation report. How do you ensure that Liberia establishes a war and economics crimes court such that anybody who bears the greatest responsibility, transnational actors and domestic actors, face the full weight of the law, right? So inequalities around income, land access, and transitional justice were important factors for ensuring that those domestic anxieties around dual citizenship are somehow addressed, right? So I gave them some concrete examples about how do you do this, right? How do you extend rights to would-be dual citizens while also extracting responsibilities from them? So for instance, you might say dual citizens have the right to vote in national as well as legislative elections, but they don't have the right to vie for elected positions, right? So holding public office is a right that only singular citizens have the right to, right? That's how you reconcile those tensions between the domestic anxieties and the diasporic aspirations. I said, you also enable those who would be dual citizens to own land, but perhaps you restrict the amount of acreage they can actually own. And you ensure that they pay property taxes and perhaps even income taxes as a form of fulfilling duties, fulfilling responsibilities. So I gave them a number of different recommendations. Some of the recommendations have been inserted in the final law that was passed in July 2022. Some of them have been discarded, but for me, the sort of biggest takeaway is that scholars, academics, researchers can have an impact, direct impact on the policymaking process if you make yourself relevant. And that's what I tried to do throughout this book. So I'm going to wrap up in a second by saying that this particular slide just is a superimposed photo of the law that was eventually passed in July 2022. If you're very interested in reading a shorter version of my book in many respects, a sort of historical trajectory of how the bill kind of evolved over a period of time, there is a superimposed screenshot of an article that was written by a Liberian journalist published in Al Jazeera a few days after the dual citizenship law was passed. That does reference my research, that does reference my book and a number of other sources. So I'm going to end there by saying thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Paley, for this fascinating analysis and to share with us your analysis on citizenship, dual citizenship in Liberia. And not only you contributed to theory and method, you also contributed to policymaking and practice. And this is really an extraordinary case for a scholarly work. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I would like to open the floor to the discussion for comments, for questions. So please, those who are on the Zoom, please raise your hand. And I see the first hand, Christine William, please.
Thank you so much, Prof. Paley, for this extremely cogent and, sort of a clear setting out of how citizenship and belonging are also so intricate in the ways we sort of navigate spaces of the continent and the sensibilities around it and sensibilities around diaspora. We are seeing entanglements here, which are extremely, shall we say, productive in its friction. I just wanted to ask, and I'm being extremely pedestrian here. I have two questions, if you don't mind. You pointed out the salience of how the socio-political category of race here works. Yeah, in determining who is a citizen of Liberia and the extent of belonging. I'm just wondering here if you could sort of address the intersectional complexities here as regards, how race and gender and class, and you talked earlier on about rural and urban spaces and the negotiations of inner Liberian space as opposed to outer Liberian space as well. Could you just please address some thoughts on that intersectional perspective, number one? And number two, I'm not quite sure if your work has taken into account the current UN decade of people of African descent, where the three pillars of recognition, justice, and development are actually also sort of foregrounded here, also against the backdrop of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that took place in Durban, South Africa. So I'm not looking for conclusive answers. I just would like to hear your thoughts on both these perspectives as regarding how you have theorized dual citizenship and these entanglements of continental life worlds and diasporic life worlds. Thank you so much. I hope that's all right. I hope that was all right.
Is it okay if I answer the questions as they come along? Because sometimes I forget what the questions are. Is that all right,
Yes.
Robert?
Just proceed, yeah.
Okay.
So please, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the question, Christine. The beauty of having Zoom conversations is you can see people's names on the screen, superimposed on the screen. Thank you for the question, Christine. So in terms of really, really rich questions. So maybe I'll start with the first one about the multi-layered, differentiated nature of Liberian citizenship, especially when we think about intersectionalities of race, class, gender, ethnicity within the case of Liberia as well. And I only mentioned a bit about race, but certainly one of the things that the new dual citizenship law was able to reconcile is a very discriminatory, sexist form of gender differentiation. So before the law was passed, Liberian citizen women could not pass on citizenship to their children born abroad. And now that has since changed because of this dual citizenship law that was passed. And it's one of the reconciliations that I mentioned to the House and the Senate when I did present to them in 2021. And I think that's, for me, it's not just Liberia that had that sort of antiquated law. A lot of countries on the continent have had that sort of antiquated law about women not being able to pass on citizenship to their children, whether the children were born in the country or outside of the country. But that's very, very much related to the issue of race as well. Because in my new research, what I'm discovering is there are a number of Liberians, a small class, and I would say increasingly because of intermarriage, because of these entanglements between Black so-called Negro Liberians and relationships with so-called non-Negroes, an increasing class of stateless people in the country because of that rule around race, but then also gender differentiation. So when I was in Liberia a couple of years ago, I was able to interview about 20 Liberians whose fathers are of non-Negro descent. So maybe their fathers are Indian, Pakistani, largely South Asian, because there are a lot of South Asian nationals who live in the country. And I'm very interested in this population of the sort of Black versus brown contestations in the country as it relates to the Negro clause. So this population of Liberians are stateless because there is a clause within the Constitution, and the law that was passed was not a constitutional change, it was a change of the Aliens and Nationality law. So there's a law in the Constitution, I think Article 8, that effectively assumes that if you have a non-Negro father, you have to declare an oath of allegiance at the age of 21. An oath of allegiance, even if you were born in the country, because your father is not of Negro descent, right? So it has all kinds of implications for people. For instance, a number of Liberians I interviewed who have Lebanese ancestry, whose fathers are Lebanese. But even Lebanon has very restrictive laws about whether or not women in Lebanon can pass on citizenship to their children. So these Liberians who have Lebanese fathers must be registered by their Lebanese fathers in Beirut in order for them to claim Lebanese citizenship. Meanwhile, the Liberian state has effectively said to them, if you do not declare an oath of allegiance, which is $1,200, you will never gain Liberian citizenship and you will never be able to travel with a Liberian passport. So I'm very curious about what does this portend for this population, and I would say an increasing population of stateless people in the country because of the Negro clause, but also because of the law that used to exist about women not being able to pass on citizenship to their children if the fathers of those children are of non-Negro descent. The other thing that's interesting to think about when we're thinking about Liberian citizenship, it's also differentiated by ethnicity. So even if you have the phenotype of a Black person, of a Negro person, you are still discriminated against. And there's a specific ethnic population called the Mandingos. And what's interesting about the Mandingos is that they're very, very much migratory in their orientation. So you have Mandingos in parts of Guinea, you have Mandingos in parts of Sierra Leone. And when I spoke to a number of phenotypically Black Mandingo Liberians, many of them argue that there is a perception that Mandingos are not Liberian citizens. So there are all these issues around intersectionalities of ethnicity, race, gender, and then obviously socioeconomic status, where scholars will argue that people of different socioeconomic statuses experience the institution of citizenship quite differently based on their socioeconomic background or their class. And that's why I'm very intentional in the book about saying that, as far as I'm concerned, citizenship is legal status as a part of it, but that's not the whole story. Right? It's the sociological that's most important, right? How people experience it, how they embody citizenship, how they practice citizenship. That's even more concrete than the fact that you wield the passport. And that's why when one of my interlocutors said, the passport doesn't matter, it's what you do with the citizenship. But more than what you do with the citizenship, how the state receives you, how other citizens receive you, that's what determines your affective experience of the institution, right? I hope I've answered your question. It's a very long-winded way of trying to
Thank you, thank you. But I would also want to throw in sexual identification into the mix. What happens with queer Liberians?
That is that's a Pandora's box. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because Liberia does have, even though it wasn't formally colonized, but it does have very colonial like penal codes. And in terms of sexual identities, very, very marginalized sexual identities in Liberia, which again, they do not experience the institution of citizenship similarly to those who might not necessarily be sexual minorities, right? So in many respects, they might be a second-class citizen, or they might be considered a second-class citizen because they have these identities that are not mainstream in that respect. So yeah, differentiated by sexual orientation as much as it is differentiated by race, ethnicity, class, so forth and so on. Thank you for bringing that in the mix. Then you asked a question about the World Conference Against Racism. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually, I didn't attend WCAR in Durban, but I was working with an institution called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. It's kind of a coalition of different civil rights organizations in Washington, DC. I was interning with them the summer before WCAR took place. And I know that there was a huge momentum around reparations, right? So what happens for post-slavery nations like Haiti, and even you could even say to a certain extent Liberia, even though technically it's not a post-slavery nation. So, you know, a lot of Liberians, when I spoke to for this new project, have argued that how can we be the bastions of, you know, rhetoric around anti-racism, rhetoric around the fact that we have this slavery history, we have this history of colonialism, even though we weren't colonized. And then still have a clause that's so explicitly discriminatory based on race, right? Could we say, one of the questions I'm asking is, could we say that this clause is racist? Perhaps in one respect, but then the counter argument would be, is it more protectionist than it is racist, is a question I'm asking. What I also try to kind of tease out is, to what extent can we say that this Negro clause is about challenging white supremacy, in as much as it might be about asserting Black personhood? So these are all the kinds of, you know, things that I'm playing around with in my head at the moment about the Negro clause. It is a new project, so I don't have any definitive kind of findings, but lots to think about.
Thank you very much for this elaborate answer. And are there more questions or comments?
Oh, sorry.
Christine, yes?
Yeah, sorry, Professor Paley, I just wanted to ask, are there any sort of resonances in Liberia or with the Liberian diasporic communities about the UN decade for people of African descent? Because like I said, they've got these three pillars they're going on about the recognition, justice, and development aspects. And it is quite a significant thing for Afro-Germans and Black Germans here. So I was wondering if within the course of your work, you had encountered any sort of, you know, parameters where this particular decade is being now thematized in any of your works, yeah?
Not concretely, but interestingly enough, in 2022 marked the 200th, I'm gonna have to make sure that I'm saying this correctly, the 200th anniversary of the settlement, or the first arrival of the Black migrant settlers who came from particularly the United States, right? So what the government of Liberia did, and it sort of in many respects harks back to that year of the year of the African, what is it? The year of the African, you were saying it's the year of the African decade, the decade of African.
Yeah, it's the UN decade for people of African descent.
Okay, thank you. The UN decade for people of African descent. And I think the government without explicitly acknowledging that UN decade, the idea of thinking about this bicentennial as a commemoration of that moment when those Black settlers arrived, the moment in which Liberia started to be conceived of as a potential nation state, as a haven for Black people, it's definitely something that came up kind of implicitly, right? But there was so much contestation around the celebration of the bicentennial because a lot of people who claim kind of indigeneity said, well, what about us? We were already here. At what point are you going to celebrate our settlement? So I think it even created friction given that fraught history of settler versus indigene, right? What does that mean in the 21st century to celebrate a bicentennial? That's not even the establishment of the nation state, because that would be in 2047. But this huge, elaborate celebration of the year of diaspora, the year of return, harking back even to Ghana's 2019 year of return. Obviously, Ghana and Liberia have very different histories in terms of settlement, in terms of migration, in terms of so forth and so on. And in many respects, it became a sort of commercial enterprise, right? So how do we extract the resources of those who would be coming back for this year of diaspora, year of return, in the same way that I think that, you know, Ghana capitalized on that and made it a commercial enterprise as well. So indirectly, 2022 kind of mirrored this UN decade.
Thank you very much. Michaela Ott raised her hand. Please, Michaela.
Yes, thank you very much. Also from my side, since I am a philosopher and very much interested in the concept of the person, which at the beginning of Western philosophy was always linked to the question of land ownership, I would like to ask you once again to elaborate a bit more on the relation of ownership and land ownership and citizenship in Liberia. I did not really understand everything. Sorry for that. Thank you.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. So when Liberia was established, that idea of the rooted indigene versus the rootless immigrant kind of later on, when Liberia was established, one of the markers of being able to claim citizenship was land ownership.
Yeah, like everywhere. Yeah.
We owned a plot of land. And in many respects, you can say that harkens back to the US kind of constitution. Where it said
exactly.
Right, you had to own land in order to claim citizenship. But that hasn't changed. In some respects it has, because it's no longer a requirement of citizenship, right? You don't have to own land to prove or to claim citizenship, but it became a conduit for barring indigenous populations from acquiring citizenship, because in many indigenous populations, even today, the idea of owning land, like having an individual ownership of a particular parcel of land, is something that's anathema, right? Liberia had to pass in 2018 something called the Land Rights Act, in which there is some sort of reconciliation between customary land and statutory land for this very, very reason, right? So for me, it harks back to that history of who was a citizen in 1847. It was someone who had come from abroad. It was someone who could buy land, who had the wherewithal to buy land, and who even thought about land as a sort of commercial commodity, whereas a lot of indigenous populations did not. Now, even though citizenship isn't a requirement land is no longer a requirement for claiming citizenship, it is an entitlement of citizenship in the 21st century. That's where the sort of shift took place. And it took place after that 1947 unification policy that enabled indigenous populations to become citizens. So that's kind of like the historical trajectory of, in 1847, owning land was a requirement for acquiring citizenship. Now it becomes an entitlement. So I hope that clarifies things a little bit for you.
Yeah, a bit more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Professor Pale. Are there more questions or comments? I would like to ask a question, Professor Paley, because you showed a table.
You guys can just call me Robtel.
Okay, Robtel, thank you.
Yeah.
You showed a table with, let's say, the attitude of the interviewees towards dual citizenship and a strong rejection in Monrovia, for example. And earlier in your presentation, you spoke about development and aspirations of development, in particular connected to migration, returnees coming back, bringing something inside, but also people going outside and sending money, for example. Do you think, is it just a kind of screenshot of a moment? And would you expect what would you expect as a development, in particular with the law that have been established?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Robert. What's interesting is that, I mean, it sounded as if I'm celebratory of the law, but I'm actually quite cynical about the law. And the reason I'm cynical about the law is it was enacted by a group of political elites who really didn't think about what the ramifications were. Because the fact of the matter is there was still a referendum in 2020, and the referendum still rejected dual citizenship as a proposition, right? So in many respects, there's sort of this underhanded undermining of the electorate who were very clear about that particular mandate. So what I've argued is, even though the law has been passed, those domestic anxieties have not disappeared. In fact, I would say because there wasn't a sort of national reckoning with the law that has such a huge implication on people in the country, land, for instance, is going to be the next kind of conflict generator, because we haven't talked about what does that mean in terms of operationalizing the law. So one of the recommendations that I made to the House and the Senate, which hasn't been implemented, unfortunately, I'm going to push them on that, is having something called the Dual Citizenship 2.0, where you actually have a supplement that explains what does it actually mean in terms of operationalization. Because you can have these broad-based laws without talking about the nitty-gritty specifics, and it's the devil is in the details, is what they say, right? So what does it mean for people now that dual citizens can own land? Liberians who previously could not claim now can come back and claim land that they previously had, where the government could have come in with some sort of eminent domain policy. So there are all these socioeconomic, concrete issues that have not been resolved as a result of passing the law. It's become this sort of political expediency that I think was rushed. It was a very rushed process. And if I had my way, I would have said, let's go back to the drawing board and let's go back to that idea of a supplement or an addendum to the law that clearly explains what does it mean in terms of concrete implementation? What does it mean in terms of operationalization? So just because a law is passed, as is the case of dual citizenship in Liberia, but as is the case of other laws that affect people's livelihoods and lives, it doesn't mean that those concerns have disappeared. In fact, I would say that it's become even more apparent that people are fearful of what does it mean for this kind of onslaught of Liberians who now can legitimately claim certain political, economic, and social rights where they couldn't before. So I'll give you an example, Robert, to make it a bit more concrete. So there's a huge lobby at the moment amongst Liberians who have dual citizenship now, who have been pushing the government to ensure that they can vote for national and legislative elections outside of the country. Now, the pushback against this is, sorry, I didn't mention, but I think Sabella mentioned that I am Liberian, so I'm going to use the we's and the us and the ours. Question that a lot of Liberians in the country are asking, or even those of us outside of the country who would be transnational actors, do we have the resources? Can we do absentee balloting at this particular stage, given that we're mired in debt? Given that, in terms of, post-COVID kind of moment, what does it mean for socioeconomic transformation in the country for those who are there? Why should the priority be capacitating embassies abroad to ensure that Liberians can vote outside of the country? What about those people in the country? What are their bread and butter issues? What are their concerns? Why are we not paying attention to those issues? So the bill has now opened up the Pandora's box that a lot of Liberians in the country were particularly concerned about. It hasn't gone away. Issues around inequality have not gone away. In fact, I would say they've become exacerbated. Issues around socioeconomic deprivation have not gone away. They've become exacerbated. And you have a law that's supposed to be development oriented. It's supposed to drive development is the assumption. So I think we have a lot of reflecting to do as a country. I think we have a lot of reflecting to do in terms of what will this policy portend now that it's been legislated.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see that Christine again raised her hand. Please, Christine.
Sorry about that, Rob Tail, but as you can see, it's kicked off loads of things with me. Please bear with me. I'm enjoying this, if you don't mind. Can I just ask, you mentioned the N clause. I'm going to be very careful here because we are very, very sensitive about the usage of such terms here in Germany. Plenty of debates.
But I'll explain, there's a difference between Negro and the other word.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That would have been part of my question as well.
Sure.
You could please to sort of explain some of the terms that you use, because this particular clause has particular juridical significances as regards the discourses around citizenship, dual citizenship. Obviously, as you've already pointed out, in sort of a relation to that, could you please share your thoughts on this question of blackness, the question of political blackness vis-a-vis a sense of Africanness? I think this is something that still is being debated in several sort of sites, and I just would like to understand how you see blackness in relation with Africanness in this particular Liberian constellation. That would be one point. And the other point is, how does religious affiliation, I'm talking here about possible negotiations or navigations between colonially inculcated belief systems like Christianity and the indigenous belief systems. How do these sort of stand in dialogue or negotiation with each other as regards the questions of belonging in Liberian citizenship? So please bear with me. I hope it wasn't too much. Thank you. But as I said, I'm enjoying this. I'm learning so much. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad. I'm also, you're asking some really tough questions that I haven't necessarily grappled with or have any sort of definitive responses to. So maybe I'll start with the idea of blackness. Oh no, clarifying the term. So Negro, the term, in fact, it's funny because when I've done the interviews, there have been some people who've been so appalled, like appalled that I'm using the word Negro, but I've had to explain in my interviews with interlocutors that the word Negro is actually a term of empowerment. I mean, Black Americans use that term in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s as a form of empowerment, as a form of, again, asserting Black personhood. Now, you're probably thinking of the other word that I will not mention that was used as a pejorative term to describe enslaved peoples. That's not the same as Negro. And in my research, I always put Negro in quotation marks because one of the questions that I'm sort of grappling with is, what does it mean to be a Negro in societies, in countries, in contexts where there is mixed raceness, where there is intermarriage, where there's bicultural kind of relationships? Does it still have the same kind of political purchase in the 21st century? Should it still have the same kind of political purchase in the 21st century? So a lot of the questions you're asking are the same questions I'm asking of this new research. And because I'm just at the stage, I'll have to come back, Sabelo, when the new book is published, hopefully in the near future, to present it, because everyone's always fascinated when I mention it. So yeah, this idea of Blackness versus Africanness is something that I'm grappling with as well. Does Blackness equal Africanness? Does Africanness require Blackness? I think it's a question, it's a policy question, but within the context of the Negro Clause, but also one that's very important for historical reasons in Liberia, given the history of enslavement, given the history of encounters with colonialism in terms of British and French encroachment in Liberia territory. So I don't have a definitive answer on that, unfortunately, but it is something that I am constantly reflecting on, given this new project. Belief systems, indigenous spiritual practices, so forth and so on. Religion. So one of the major critiques that I've gotten, and I think it's a valid critique, in speaking to a lot of people and presenting my book, is that, oh, but you don't talk about ethnicity as much as perhaps is more relevant than you give it relevance. And I said, and my response is always, yes, there are other forms of kin-based citizenship that have nothing to do with the nation state. So the critique is I center the nation state in a way that's that might be problematic, given that it very much, in many respects, privileges this sort of Westphalian system, state system, right? And the pushback that I often give to that critique, although I think it's a valid critique, because you've got region-based citizenship, kind of people pledge fealty to their region, they pledge fealty to their ethnicity, they pledge fealty to their kin. They don't necessarily pledge fealty to any sort of nation state that is superimposed on them, right? But the pushback that I often sort of give is when I was asking Liberians in these 5 cities, in these 5 countries, in these 5 continents, I didn't have a prescriptive definition of citizenship. What I asked them is, who do you believe to be a Liberian citizen? When you say Liberian citizen, what does that mean to you? So it's very qualitative in terms of the way that I ask people. And what's interesting, Christine and others, is that ethnicity came up quite infrequently. So that's why it doesn't feature in my analytical conceptual framework, because most people who talked about citizenship, they talked about citizenship, not so much in the nation state kind of framework, but the idea of there is a relationship, right? That maintaining and cultivating of a relationship between citizen and citizen, but also between citizen and government, citizen and state, right? And although ethnicity did come up in certain contexts, it came up within the context of certain ethnicities in Liberia feeling as if citizenship is a better framework for thinking about belonging, because in many respects, citizenship has, ethnicity has always been politicized in the country, where they'll say, oh, you're Mandingo. You were born in Liberia, and by definition, by law, you're a Liberian citizen, but you're Mandingo, and you can trace your lineage to Mali, you can trace your lineage to Sierra Leone, you can trace your lineage to Guinea. Therefore, you're not a real Liberian. So these Mandingos that I spoke to said, no, we are citizens. And if you use that framework of citizenship in its broad-based terms, then no one should ever deny us citizenship, right? So I think in many respects, because of the politicization of ethnicity during the armed conflict, before the armed conflict, and even today when people kind of hark back to indigeneity as being a form of political belonging, a lot of people will say, let's do away with that, because at the end of the day, we're all Liberians through and through. And that idea of the political economy of belonging is a force of unity. It's a force of unification in a way that thinking about ethnicity, thinking about kinship, thinking about these other forms of identification and identity aren't necessarily a form of unifying us. And you could say in some respects that religion is part and parcel of that, right? So the Mandingos are not just an ethnic minority, but they're also a religious minority. They're Muslim, right? In a country that, even though there's a separation of church and state in the Constitution, a lot of Liberians will say Liberia was founded on Christian principles. But what does that mean for people who do Christianity, who practice indigenous forms of philosophy, who are not very interested in even Islam, for instance? What does that mean for them in terms of that idea of belonging as well?
Thank you. I see that Sabelo raised his hand.
Okay, no, thank you so much for this very detailed presentation on various aspects, which not only make us reflect on Liberia, but on many other post-colonial societies. But my interest is really thinking from Liberia into West Africa and into the continent. I think I saw some people who said they are carrying ECOWAS passports. Is Liberia a member of ECOWAS? That's one. If it is a member of ECOWAS, what really are your reflections thinking from Liberia into pan-regionalism, the ECOWAS project, and also the broader Pan-African agenda?
Yeah, really, really important questions. And I'm glad that you're bringing these back to the themes of the seminar series. I'm not sure I did a very good job of that. You know what's interesting about the Liberian case study? It's almost as if the country has been written out of that Pan-African narrative, even though it was very, very part and parcel of the Pan-African narrative. So I always argue, I don't know how many people are familiar with Edward Wilmot Blyden. So Blyden was, I would say, the the progenitor of Pan-Africanism. I mean, he talked about Pan-African ideals before there was even any kind of conceptualization of Pan-Africanism, you know, long before Nkrumah and Padmore and all the others, right? So he talked about this idea of the African identity. He talked about this idea of how do you eschew these sort of colonial, superimposed colonial kind of divisions amongst people of African descent or people on the continent of Africa? How do you ensure that people who are coming from Barbados, who are coming from Jamaica, who are coming from other parts of the Americas are welcomed? He was from the Virgin Islands, right? Blyden migrated to Liberia in the early 1800s and became a statesman of Liberia. I think he served as ambassador to the UK. He was like the first president of the Liberia College, which is now the University of Liberia. This was someone from Virgin Islands who naturalized in Liberia because he was of Negro African descent. So there's a whole project by people like Carl Patrick Burroughs, the Liberian historian, who are trying it's sort of revisionist history, but writing Liberia back into the Pan-African narrative and saying, wait a second, why is it that it's been written out in the first place? Because Liberia, in many respects, whether you agree with it or not, was founded on abolitionist principles, right? It was founded on Pan-African principles. That idea of a safe haven for Black people from across the world is, I don't know, if I feel like that's the most Pan-African ideal that, you know. So there is a project amongst Liberian historians, amongst Liberianists, who are trying to rewrite the Pan-African story in such a way that Liberia is central to that. In terms of ECOWAS, Liberia's place in ECOWAS, what's interesting, Sabelo and others, is when I spoke to policymakers who sponsored the dual citizenship bill, they admitted to me that they were very, very much influenced by what was happening in Ghana. They were very, very much influenced by what was happening in places like Sierra Leone, in places like Senegal, in places like Mali, that are very welcoming of their diasporic transnational actors, right? And that even though they don't have the same kinds of migratory histories as Liberia, were more open to liberalizing citizenship laws than Liberia was, right? But the argument that I've made in the book and tried to, maybe wasn't clear of in the presentation, is that it's precisely because of that 1847 moment where you had the separation of who is a first-class citizen and who's a second-class citizen, who is a citizen, who is a not citizen, that 100 years where the rooted indigent was barred from citizenship. That's why we have the contestations in Liberia that we have now that weren't necessarily present in other countries like Senegal, Mali, so forth and so on. So that's a history that we have to reckon with, and I don't think we have, even in the midst of a passage of dual citizenship. But what the policymakers said to me was they were heavily influenced by what had happened in other countries, reconciling that in June 2022, before the dual citizenship law was passed, Sabelo, Liberia was the only West African country that prohibited dual citizenship. And given that you got this sort of sub-regional force, such as ECOWAS, how can you be an outlier in that respect when all the other ECOWAS countries have passed dual citizenship, given your history of migration? So it's almost like we were an eyesore, historical eyesore because of that. And I think a lot of the policymakers felt this sort of pressure, not only from diasporic and the transnational, but also what was happening within the sub-region in ECOWAS. And if we are going to say we want to support free movement of persons within ECOWAS, we want to support free movement or free settlement within ECOWAS, we have to ensure that our citizenship laws are aligned. And if you're not going to allow our citizens to naturalize and retain their birthright citizenship and then obtain their Liberian citizenship, there's something fundamentally wrong with that. So I think it was that the Pan-African spirit, but also the kind of ECOWAS spirit that pushed the needle in a particular direction amongst policymakers.
Thank you very much. I would like to take up the last question or comment here, but then I think, Sabelo, that we should come to an end with the session. Please.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for a fascinating presentation. I have one question regarding one of the objections to dual citizenship has always been about loyalty, that especially states are concerned about divided loyalty. If citizens hold dual citizenship. And in the presentation, I like the way you presented citizenship as not only a construction that is imposed from above, but also reconstructed from below. Now, on this fear of divided loyalties, do citizens share the same, or is it completely a concern of state elites? Yeah.
Very, very good question. And something that I definitely grapple with. So I don't know if you remember when I mentioned about how executive level policymakers were a bit more apprehensive about dual citizenship than their legislative counterparts were. And I think it's precisely because of that reason. So I was able to interview the Minister of Defense, for instance, who's a former colleague of mine. I forgot to mention that I did work for the government of Liberia for 4 years, and I worked specifically for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So there's like insider knowledge as well as outsider knowledge. And I found that it was the political appointees, especially those who had been recruited from abroad, it was the political appointees, many of whom were recruited from within, who felt the most anxiety around dual citizenship. And that question of divided loyalties definitely came up over and over and over again. So one of the contestations, or one of the sort of concerns, was that if you are going to legislate dual citizenship, ensure that there are certain positions within government that dual citizens should never be able to hold. And that's an argument that, I mean, that's a position that I hold. I believe that a minister of national defense shouldn't have 2 passports. I believe fundamentally that a minister of, or the head of the army of a country shouldn't have 2 passports, because there's something fundamentally concerning about that. But more importantly, I think the issue of divided loyalties was one that had been tactilely experienced by Liberians. So I'll give one example in which there's in that dichotomy of diasporic developmentalism, I talk about this idea of the Taylor-Corcoran nexus. And there are 2 examples that I give. I'll just explain one because it might be too elaborate to try to get into the other one. But you're familiar with Charles Taylor, the warlord turned president of Liberia. He's got an interesting story. So this Taylor-Corcoran nexus comes from the story of Charles Taylor. So Charles Taylor spent a number of years as a diasporic transnational Liberian, lived in the Boston area in the United States. He was very, very much a force for change, pushing for some sort of democratization in the country in the 1970s. He's invited in the 1980s to actually become a part of the government, right, of Samuel Kayando's government. He serves in the capacity of the head of the General Services Agency, which is like the procurement arm of government. In the mid-1980s, Charles Taylor is accused of stealing about $1 million from the coffers of the GSA. Because he had permanent residency, and some people have speculated that perhaps he even had a US passport. What does he do? He packs up and he leaves. He goes back to the United States. For about 2 or 3 years, Liberia is entangled in this back and forth with the United States to extradite Charles Taylor back to Liberia to face the full weight of the law. He escapes from a maximum security prison while he's being held. And then what does he do? He travels through Libya, gets, trained by Gaddafi, and then ends up and comes to Liberia and wreaks havoc for 8-9 years. So a lot of people will invoke that idea of the Taylor-Corcoran nexus, right? To say that's a classic, concrete, tactile example of why we shouldn't have dual citizenship, because people who have 2 passports have this divided loyalty. They have no fealty to Liberia. They have no stake in ensuring that there is no political upheaval, because they can just pack up and leave. And there are no consequences of that flight. There are no consequences of that exit. So for specific positions within government, the law, there are 3 positions in government that the current law prohibits anyone from having dual citizenship. But my argument was we needed to expand that list to make it even longer, because of this experience of, again, that idea of post-war profiteering, right? Or using your perch from abroad to fuel armed conflict, using your resources from abroad to fuel armed conflict. What does that mean for a post-war country that has experienced tactile political upheaval? Divided loyalties is part and parcel of that contestation. So it wasn't just political elites who were concerned, it was Liberians who had experienced the war and knew what it meant for someone to have the wherewithal to leave because they have another passport. And not just have to have the wherewithal to leave, but to also fund, finance, support the continuance of political upheaval and war and conflict, because you don't have to feel the consequences of that. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robtel, for your fascinating, as I said, presentation, for this analysis. And I've learned a lot today. And I would like to hand over now to Sabelo for a couple of closing words.
Thank you so much. What can I say except that this event really fitted very well the Africa Day. The issues which you raised really makes us to reflect on so many of the African, post-colonial African problems, particular of belonging. And indeed, your work also touched on interesting issues theoretically, the concept of diaspora. That was very interesting to me, and we cannot thank you enough. This was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Looking forward to your next book. Sure,
I'd love to come and present. Thanks to everyone for staying the course, because I know it's been 2 hours.
And the very fact that you ended up invited by the government to come and assist in policy, this means your book is very successful.
Maybe.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks again, and happy Africa Day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.